The alien arrival. Zax peered through the viewscreen of his small interstellar craft as it descended through Earth's atmosphere. The blue and green planet grew larger, its continents coming into focus. As a xenoanthropologist from the distant world of Vexoria, Zax had spent years studying humanity from afar. Now he was finally going to experience their culture firsthand. The ship's computer chirped, alerting Zax to their imminent landing. He engaged the cloaking device, rendering the sleek, silver vessel invisible to human detection systems. With practiced ease, he guided the craft to a secluded clearing on the outskirts of a bustling human city. As the ship touched down, Zax took a deep breath, his iridescent scales shimmering with excitement. He checked his appearance in a reflective panel. His holographic disguise was working perfectly, making him appear as a tall, slender human male with nondescript features. It wasn't a perfect disguise up close, but it would allow him to blend in from a distance. Zax gathered his belongings, a collection of data pads, sensory equipment, and a universal translator, and stepped out of his ship. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and distant wood smoke. He tapped a button on his wrist device, and the ship shimmered before disappearing entirely, now hidden and protected. With a small anti-gravity device disguised as a wheeled suitcase, Zax made his way towards the city. His research had led him to this particular location, a mid-sized American town with a rich history and diverse population. It was the perfect place to begin his immersive study of human culture. As he walked, Zax marveled at the changing colors of the trees. On Vexoria, plant life was predominantly in shades of purple and blue. The vibrant reds, oranges, and yellows of Earth's autumn were a feast for his eyes. Soon, he reached the outskirts of the town. Quaint houses with manicured lawns lined the streets. Humans of various ages went about their daily routines, some walking dogs, others tending to gardens or chatting with neighbors. Zax's translator picked up snippets of conversation, and he found himself fascinated by the casual interactions. He made his way to a small office building with a sign that read Crown Row Realty. This was where he would finalize the purchase of his new home, a crucial step in his mission to live among humans and study their ways. A bell chimed as Zax entered the office. The middle-aged woman with a warm smile greeted him. "Welcome to Crown Row Realty. I'm Linda. How can I help you today?" Zax cleared his throat, hoping his voice modulator would work as intended. "Hello, Linda. My name is Zax. Zachary Miller. I'm here about the house on Crown Row. We spoke over the phone." Recognition flickered in Linda's eyes. "Oh yes, Mr. Miller, of course. The Victorian on 1313 Crown Row. Are you sure you wouldn't like to see some of our other listings? That particular house has been difficult to sell." Zax's interest peaked. Difficult? How so? Linda hesitated, her smile faltering slightly. "Well, it's a beautiful property with a lot of history, but some people find it a bit unsettling. There have been stories over the years. Nothing concrete, of course, just local legends and such." This only intrigued Zax further. What better way to study human culture than through their legends and superstitions? "I'm quite interested in history and local folklore," he said. "Perhaps you could tell me more about these stories." Linda glanced around, as if checking for eavesdroppers, then leaned in closer. "Well, they say the house is haunted. Silly, I know. But back in the 1920s, there was a murder there. A wealthy businessman and his wife. It was quite the scandal at the time. Some say their spirits never left the house." Zax struggled to contain his excitement. Haunting. Spirits. These were concepts he had encountered in his preliminary research, but never fully understood. This house was turning out to be an even more fascinating subject than he had anticipated. "That sounds absolutely fascinating," Zax said, trying to keep his voice level. "I'd love to learn more about the history of the house. In fact, I think I'm ready to finalize the purchase today, if possible." Linda's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Really? Well, that's wonderful news, Mr. Miller. Let me just pull up the paperwork, and we can get started right away. As Linda busied herself with documents, Zach's mind raced with possibilities. A house with a dark history, local legends, and potential supernatural activity. It was the perfect base for his research into human culture and beliefs. The next few hours passed in a blur of signatures and explanations. Zach's careful preparation paid off. His false identity and financial arrangements held up to scrutiny. By late afternoon, he was the proud owner of 1313 Crown Row. Linda handed him a set of old-fashioned keys. "Congratulations, Mr. Miller. The house is yours. I hope you'll be very happy there." She paused, then added with a hint of concern, "And if you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to call." Zach thanked her and left the office, his anti-gravity suitcase trailing behind him. As he walked down Crown Row, the houses became older and more ornate. Finally, he stood before 1313, a towering Victorian mansion with intricate gingerbread trim, a wraparound porch, and a widow's walk atop the third story. The house loomed over him, its windows dark and uninviting. For a moment, Zach felt a strange sensation, a prickling along his scales that his species associated with danger. He shook it off, attributing the feeling to simple nervousness about beginning his mission. As he approached the front door, a cool breeze rustled the overgrown bushes flanking the porch steps. Zach could have sworn he heard a faint whisper on the wind, but his sensitive hearing couldn't make out any words. He inserted the key into the lock, which turned with a heavy clunk. The door creaked open, revealing a dusty foyer. Zach stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the empty house. The air was stale, carrying the musty scent of age and neglect. Ornate wallpaper, faded and peeling in places, covered the walls. A grand staircase curved up to the second floor, its banister thick with dust. Zach moved from room to room, taking in the antique furnishings left behind by previous owners. Heavy velvet drapes blocked most of the natural light, leaving the rooms in perpetual twilight. In the parlor, he found a collection of old photographs on the mantel. Sepia-toned faces stared back at him, stern-looking humans in outdated clothing, their eyes seeming to follow him as he moved. As the sun began to set, long shadows crept across the rooms. Zach activated the house's electrical system, but many of the ancient light fixtures flickered weakly or failed to turn on at all. He made a mental note to have the wiring checked. After all, he needed to maintain his cover as a normal human homeowner. In the kitchen, Zach found an old refrigerator humming quietly. Out of curiosity, he opened it, only to be met with a wave of fetid air and the sight of long-expired food items. Quickly closing the door, he decided that a thorough cleaning would be his first priority. As night fell, Zach settled into a dusty armchair in the library. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with volumes on history, literature, and local lore. Perfect resources for his research. He pulled out a datapad and began making notes on his initial observations of the house and the human customs he'd encountered so far. A sudden creak from upstairs made Zach freeze. He listened intently, but the sound didn't repeat. Probably just the house settling, he reasoned, recalling information about the noises old earth structures often made. Hours passed as Zach pored over his notes and initial findings. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed midnight, startling him from his work. As the last chime faded, a new sound reached his ears, soft, shuffling footsteps from the floor above. Zach's heart raced. Was someone else in the house? Had he missed signs of an intruder during his initial inspection? Or could it be? No, he pushed the thought away. Ghosts weren't real. They were simply human superstitions, stories told to explain the unknown. There had to be a logical explanation. Gathering his courage, Zach crept up the grand staircase, wincing at every creak of the old wood. The upstairs hallway was dark, the weak light from downstairs casting long, distorted shadows. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Is anyone there?" No response came, but the shuffling sound continued, seeming to move from room to room. Zax followed the noise, his heart pounding. He reached for the doorknob of the master bedroom, where the sound had last been heard. Taking a deep breath, he turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty. Moonlight streamed through a gap in the heavy curtains, illuminating a four-poster bed and antique vanity. Everything was still, covered in a thick layer of dust. There was no sign that anyone had been in the room recently. Zax let out a sigh of relief, chuckling at his own nervousness. Clearly, his imagination had gotten the better of him. The sound must have been caused by the wind, or perhaps small animals in the walls. Old houses often had such issues, according to his research. As he turned to leave the room, something caught his eye. In the moonlight, he could see a dark stain on the hardwood floor near the bed. It was large, roughly the size and shape of a human body. Zax knelt to examine it closer, his scientific curiosity overriding his unease. The stain had seeped deep into the wood, resisting years of cleaning attempts. As Zax's fingers brushed the discolored area, a chill ran through his body. For a split second, he could have sworn he saw a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye, a shadowy figure standing by the bed. But when he turned to look, there was nothing there. Zax stood quickly, his heart racing once again. He backed out of the room, closing the door firmly behind him. As he made his way back downstairs, he tried to rationalize what he had seen and felt. It was late, he was tired from his journey, and the human stories about the house had clearly influenced his perceptions. Tomorrow, he decided, he would begin his research in earnest. He would explore the town, meet his neighbors, and delve into the history of 1313 Crown Row. Whatever secrets the house held, supernatural or otherwise, he was determined to uncover them. As Zax settled into his makeshift bed on the library sofa, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. In the quiet of the night, he could have sworn he heard faint whispers and the rustle of movement from the floors above. But as sleep finally claimed him, Zax's last thoughts were of excitement for the adventure ahead. He had come to Earth to study humanity, and it seemed that 1313 Crown Row would provide him with more material than he could have ever imagined. Little did Zax know that his greatest challenges and his most profound lessons about humanity still lay ahead, hidden in the shadows of his new home. Strange occurrences. The following morning, Zax awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented by his unfamiliar surroundings. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the heavy curtains, casting long beams across the dusty library floor. As the events of the previous day came rushing back, excitement bubbled up within him. He was really here, on Earth, ready to begin his research into human culture. Zax stretched, his holographic disguise flickering briefly before stabilizing. He made a mental note to adjust the device's sleep mode settings. It wouldn't do to have his true form revealed by an ill-timed nap. As he stood, a wave of dizziness washed over him. The air in the house felt thick, almost oppressive. Zax chalked it up to the dust and lack of ventilation. Opening a window, he took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, letting it clear his head. His first order of business was to make the house livable. Zax had studied human cleaning techniques extensively, but putting them into practice proved more challenging than anticipated. He fumbled with the ancient vacuum cleaner, sending clouds of dust into the air that made him sneeze uncontrollably. His attempts at dusting often resulted in knocking over delicate ornaments, each near disaster making him wince. As the morning wore on, Zax made slow but steady progress. The parlor was looking almost presentable when a loud thud from upstairs made him jump. He froze, listening intently. Silence followed, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. "Hello," Zax called out, his voice echoing through the empty house. No response came. Cautiously, he climbed the stairs, wincing at each creak of the old wood. The upstairs hallway was dim, shadows lurking in every corner. Zax's heart raced as he approached the master bedroom, where he thought the sound had originated. He pushed the door open slowly, half expecting to find an intruder. Instead, he was greeted by an empty room, sunlight streaming through the now open curtains. A heavy book lay on the floor beside the bedside table, apparently having fallen of its own accord. Zax let out a nervous chuckle, chiding himself for being so jumpy. He picked up the book, a history of the local area, and placed it back on the nightstand. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. The dark stain on the floor, the one he'd noticed the night before, seemed larger somehow. Zax shook his head, certain he must be imagining things. Returning downstairs, Zax tried to focus on his cleaning, but he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. Small noises, creaks, thumps, and whispers seemed to follow him from room to room. More than once, he caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, only to find nothing when he turned to look. By mid-afternoon, Zax needed a break. He decided to explore the town, hoping some fresh air and human interaction would clear his mind. As he stepped onto the porch, he noticed his next-door neighbor, an elderly woman, tending to her garden. "Good afternoon," Zax called out, waving in what he hoped was a friendly, human-like manner. The woman looked up, squinting at him. "Well, hello there," she replied, her voice a mix of curiosity and caution. "You must be the new owner. I'm Margaret Wilson." Zax walked over to the fence separating their properties, extending his hand as he'd learned was customary. "Pleased to meet you, Margaret. I'm Zachary Miller." Margaret shook his hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Mr. Miller. I must say, we were all a bit surprised when we heard someone had finally bought the old Crowley place. It's been empty for so long." "Oh." Zax's curiosity was piqued. "Why is that?" Margaret glanced at the house, a shadow passing over her face. "Well, it's got quite a history, that place. Not all of it pleasant. Some folks say it's haunted, but that's just silly superstition, of course." Zax nodded, trying to appear casually interested rather than burning with curiosity. "I'd love to hear more about the history. I'm quite interested in local lore." Margaret seemed to hesitate for a moment, then sighed. "Well, I suppose you ought to know, living there and all. The story goes that back in the 1920s, the house belonged to Victor Crowley, a wealthy businessman. He and his wife, Elizabeth, were found dead in the master bedroom. Brutal murder, it was. Never did catch who did it." Zax's mind raced, connecting this new information with the stain he'd seen on the bedroom floor. "That's terrible," he managed to say, trying to keep his voice steady. "What happened after that?" "Oh, the house passed through a few owners over the years," Margaret continued, "but nobody ever stayed long. Always complaints about strange noises, things moving on their own. That sort of nonsense. Eventually, people just stopped buying it altogether. Until you came along, that is." Zax thanked Margaret for the information, his mind whirling. As he walked down Crown Row, he found himself looking at the old house with new eyes. Could there be some truth to the haunting stories? He shook his head, reminding himself that he was a scientist. There had to be a logical explanation for everything he'd experienced. The rest of the afternoon passed uneventfully as Zax explored the town, making mental notes on human behavior and customs. He picked up some groceries and cleaning supplies, determined to make his new home more livable. As dusk fell, Zax returned to 1313 Crown Row. The house loomed before him, its windows dark and uninviting. For a moment, he could have sworn he saw a figure standing in one of the upstairs windows, but when he blinked, it was gone. Inside, Zax busied himself with putting away his purchases and continuing his cleaning efforts. As night deepened, the house seemed to come alive with small sounds, creaks, whispers, and the occasional thud. Zax tried to ignore them, focusing instead on his research notes. Around midnight, as Zax was preparing for bed, a loud crash from the kitchen made him jump. Heart racing, he crept towards the sound. In the kitchen, he found a cabinet door wide open and several plates shattered on the floor. As Zax knelt to clean up the mess, A chill ran down his spine. He could have sworn the cabinet had been closed when he left the kitchen earlier, and the plates had been stacked securely. How could they have fallen? Just then, a soft whisper seemed to float through the air. "Get out." Zack spun around, his eyes wide. "Hello? Is someone there?" The kitchen remained empty, silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Shaken, Zack finished cleaning up the broken plates and retreated to the library. He tried to convince himself that he was imagining things, that the stories and the old house were playing tricks on his mind. But as he settled onto the sofa for another night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone. The next few days fell into an uneasy pattern. Zack spent his mornings and afternoons in town, observing human behavior and occasionally striking up conversations with locals. He learned more about the history of Crown Row and the legends surrounding his house, each story adding to the growing sense of unease he felt. But it was the evenings that truly tested him. As darkness fell each night, the strange occurrences in the house seemed to intensify. Books would fall from shelves without being touched. Doors would slam shut on their own. The temperature would drop suddenly in certain rooms, Zack's breath visible in the air despite the warm autumn weather outside. On the fourth night, things escalated. Zack was in the study, reviewing his notes, when a blood-curdling scream echoed through the house. He leaped to his feet, his heart pounding. The scream seemed to have come from upstairs. Gathering his courage, Zack climbed the stairs, every sense on high alert. The upstairs hallway was pitch black, the darkness seeming to swallow the beam of his flashlight. As he approached the master bedroom, he heard what sounded like muffled sobs coming from inside. With a trembling hand, Zack pushed open the door. The room was ice cold, his breath coming out in visible puffs. In the dim light of his flashlight, he saw a figure huddled in the corner, a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her body shaking with sobs. "Hello," Zack called out, his voice quavering. "Are you all right?" The woman's head snapped up, and Zack stumbled back in shock. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunk in dark pits. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but instead of words, a horrifying shriek filled the air. The figure lunged towards Zack, her form flickering and distorting. Zack turned and ran, his heart pounding in his ears. He didn't stop until he was outside the house, gasping for breath on the front lawn. As he looked back at the house, he saw the woman's face in the upstairs window, her expression one of utter despair. In that moment, Zack realized he was dealing with something far beyond his understanding. The human concepts of ghosts and hauntings, which he had dismissed as superstition, suddenly seemed all too real. Shaken to his core, Zack spent the rest of the night in his ship, the familiar surroundings providing some comfort. As the sun rose, he knew he had a decision to make. He had come to Earth to study human culture, but he now found himself embroiled in a mystery that challenged everything he thought he knew about the nature of reality. Part of him wanted to flee, to return to the safety and rationality of his home world. But a stronger part, the scientist, the explorer, knew he couldn't walk away. Whatever was happening in that house, whatever the truth behind the haunting might be, he had to uncover it. As Zack walked back to the house, determination setting in, he didn't notice the figure watching him from the shadows of a nearby alley. The observer, a middle-aged man with keen eyes, jotted something in a small notebook before slipping away unnoticed. Zack stood before 1313 Crown Row, steeling himself for what lay ahead. He would get to the bottom of this mystery, no matter what it took. Little did he know that his investigation would not only unravel the secrets of the house, but also teach him profound lessons about humanity, their capacity for both darkness and light, their resilience in the face of the unknown, and the power of seeking truth and justice, even beyond the grave. As he stepped back into the house, the door creaking shut behind him, Zack couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The truth was out there, hidden in the shadows and whispers of 1313 Crown Row, and he was determined to find it. The human connection. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the heavy curtains of 1313 Crown Row as Zax paced the library, his mind racing. The events of the previous night had shaken him to his core, challenging everything he thought he knew about the universe. As a scientist, he had always believed in the power of observation and empirical evidence. But how could he explain what he had seen? A ghost, an actual visible specter, defied all scientific explanation. Zax's datapad lay open on the antique desk, filled with notes and observations. But for the first time in his career, he felt utterly lost. His training hadn't prepared him for this. He needed help, human help. Someone who understood this world and its mysteries better than he did. A gentle knock at the front door startled Zax from his thoughts. Cautiously, he approached, peering through the peephole. On the porch stood a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, dressed in tweed and carrying a leather satchel. Zax opened the door, his holographic disguise firmly in place. "Can I help you?" he asked, trying to keep the nervousness out of his voice. The man smiled warmly. "Good morning. Dr. Zachary Miller, I presume. I'm Professor Thomas Hawthorne from the local university. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I couldn't resist introducing myself when I heard someone had finally moved into the old Crowley place." Zax's anxiety eased slightly at the man's friendly demeanor. "It's nice to meet you, Professor Hawthorne. Would you like to come in?" As Thomas stepped into the foyer, his eyes widened with appreciation. "My word, it's been years since I've been inside. You've done some cleaning up, I see. The place looks much better." Zax led the professor to the library, where they settled into a pair of high-backed armchairs. "I'm curious, Professor," Zax began. "What brings you here? Surely it's not just to welcome a new neighbor." Thomas chuckled. "Perceptive, aren't you? You're right, of course. I'm a historian, specializing in local folklore and unexplained phenomena. This house has been a subject of my research for years. When I heard someone had moved in, well, I couldn't resist the opportunity to speak with you." Zax leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Unexplained phenomena? You mean like—" He hesitated, unsure how to broach the subject. "Ghosts." Thomas finished for him, a knowing glint in his eye. "Among other things, yes. I'd spent my career studying the intersection of history, folklore, and the paranormal. This house, in particular, has a fascinating history." For a moment, Zax wrestled with himself. Should he tell this human what he had experienced? Would Thomas think him crazy? But as he looked into the professor's kind, curious eyes, Zax made a decision. He needed allies in this strange world, and Thomas might be just the person to help him understand what was happening. "Professor Hawthorne," Zax began slowly, "what would you say if I told you I've seen things in this house? Things that can't be explained by conventional science." Thomas leaned back, his expression serious but not surprised. "I'd say you're not the first, Dr. Miller. This house has a way of revealing its secrets to those who live within its walls. Would you be willing to share what you've experienced?" Over the next hour, Zax recounted the strange occurrences he'd witnessed, the moving objects, the unexplainable sounds, and finally, the apparition of the woman in the bedroom. As he spoke, Thomas listened intently, occasionally jotting notes in a small leather-bound journal. When Zax finished, Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you for sharing this with me, Dr. Miller," he said finally. "I know it couldn't have been easy. Many people would have fled after experiencing what you have." Zax shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "I'm a scientist at heart, Professor. I can't walk away from a mystery like this. I need to understand what's happening here." Thomas smiled. "A scientist, eh? Interesting. Well, you've come to the right place for mysteries. The Crowley House has been a source of local legend for nearly a century. But your experiences, they align remarkably well with other accounts I've gathered over the years. So you believe me?" Zax asked, relief evident in his voice. "I do," Thomas nodded. And I'd like to help you get to the bottom of this, if you'll let me. There's more to the Crowley murder than most people know. I've been researching it for years, but I've never had access to the house like this before. Zax felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't alone in this anymore. I'd be grateful for your help, Professor. Where do we start? Thomas opened his satchel, pulling out a stack of old newspapers and photographs. We start with the history. The official story is that Victor and Elizabeth Crowley were murdered in their bedroom. The killer never caught. But I've always suspected there was more to it than that. As Thomas spread the documents across the desk, Zax leaned in, fascinated. The yellowed newspapers told of a grisly double murder that had shocked the town. Photographs showed the house as it had been in the 1920s, surrounded by police and curious onlookers. Victor Crowley was a powerful man, Thomas explained. He had his hand in every business in town, not always legally. He made enemies. The police of the time assumed it was a robbery gone wrong, but I think it was something more personal. Zax picked up a photograph of the Crowleys. Victor, a stern-faced man with a thick mustache, and Elizabeth, a beautiful young woman with sad eyes. What makes you think that? Thomas pointed to Elizabeth. Her. She was Victor's second wife, much younger than him. Rumors at the time suggested she was unhappy in the marriage. Some even whispered about an affair. As they pored over the documents, the grandfather clock in the hall chimed noon. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the library, ruffling the papers on the desk. Zax and Thomas exchanged a look of surprise. Did you feel that? Zax asked, his heart's racing. Thomas nodded, his eyes wide. I did. It seems we're not alone in our investigation. Just then, a book flew off one of the shelves, landing with a thud at their feet. Zax picked it up, his hands trembling slightly. It was an old photo album, its leather cover cracked with age. As they opened it, a slip of paper fell out, a handwritten note in faded ink. Thomas read it aloud, his voice hushed. My dearest E, meet me at our usual place tonight. We must make plans. I cannot bear to see you suffer any longer. Forever yours, J. Zax and Thomas looked at each other, the implications of the note sinking in. E must be Elizabeth, Zax said. But who is J? Thomas's eyes gleamed with excitement. I don't know, but I think we've just stumbled onto a vital clue. This could be evidence of the affair that was rumored. If Victor found out, it could have been a motive for murder, Zax finished. As if in response to their discovery, the temperature in the room plummeted. Zax could see his breath misting in the air. The lights flickered, and a low moan seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Thomas stood, his face pale but determined. I think we've stirred up something, Dr. Miller. The spirits in this house, they want us to know the truth. But we need to be careful. Angry ghosts can be dangerous. Zax nodded, trying to calm his racing hearts. What do we do now? We dig deeper, Thomas said, gathering up the documents. I need to cross-reference this note with other records from the time. And you, Dr. Miller, need to be our eyes and ears in this house. The spirits seem to be responding to you. Keep documenting everything you experience. As Thomas prepared to leave, Zax felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. He was no longer just an observer of human culture. He had become an active participant in unraveling the decades-old mystery. Oh, and Dr. Miller, Thomas said as he reached the door, I'd like to bring in a colleague of mine, if you don't mind. Sarah Chen. She's a forensic psychic. I know it sounds unconventional, but she's helped me on cases like this before. Her insights could be valuable. Zax agreed, marveling at how quickly he had gone from skeptic to believer. As he watched Thomas drive away, he couldn't help but feel that he was standing on the precipice of something monumental. The secrets of 1313 Crown Row were beginning to unravel, and with them, Zax's understanding of the universe was expanding in ways he never could have imagined. That night, as Zax prepared for bed, the house seemed more alive than ever. Whispers echoed through the halls and shadows danced at the edge of his vision. But instead of fear, Zax felt a growing sense of purpose. He was no longer just a visitor studying human culture. He had become a crucial part of a human story, one that spanned nearly a century. As he drifted off to sleep, Zax's last thoughts were of Elizabeth Crowley and the mysterious J. What was their story? What had really happened on that fateful night so long ago? And most importantly, how could he, an alien from across the stars, help bring them justice and peace? Little did Zax know that his journey into the heart of this human mystery was just beginning. The spirits of 1313 Crown Row had chosen him for a reason, and as he slept, they watched over him, waiting for the moment when all would be revealed. In the darkness of the master bedroom, a figure materialized, the ghostly form of Elizabeth Crowley. She gazed down at the sleeping alien with a mixture of hope and sadness. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely a breath in the night. "Help us. Set us free." As if in response, Zax stirred in his sleep, murmuring words in his native language. The ghost of Elizabeth watched for a moment longer before fading away, leaving behind only a lingering chill in the air and the faint scent of lavender, a silent promise that the truth would soon come to light. Confrontation and revelation. The following days passed in a whirlwind of research and increasingly strange occurrences. Zax found himself fully immersed in the mystery of the Crowley murders, his original mission of studying human culture taking on a new, unexpected dimension. Professor Hawthorne had become a regular visitor to 1313 Crown Row, often arriving with armfuls of old documents and historical records. Together, they pieced together the puzzle of Victor and Elizabeth Crowley's life and death, uncovering a web of secrets that had long been buried. On a particularly chilly autumn evening, Zax paced the library, waiting for Thomas to arrive with his colleague, Sarah Chen. The house seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, as if it knew something momentous was about to happen. A knock at the door jolted Zax from his thoughts. He opened it to find Thomas and a petite woman with long black hair and piercing dark eyes. "Dr. Miller, this is Sarah Chen." Thomas introduced them. "Sarah, meet Dr. Zachary Miller, the current owner of the Crowley house." Sarah's eyes seemed to look right through Zax, making him momentarily fear that she could see through his holographic disguise. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Dr. Miller," she said, her voice soft but confident. "This house, it has quite the energy about it." As they settled in the library, Sarah closed her eyes, her brow furrowing in concentration. "There's so much pain here," she murmured. "So many secrets. But also hope. They're waiting for something. For someone." Zax and Thomas exchanged glances. "What do you mean, Sarah?" Thomas asked gently. Sarah opened her eyes, focusing on Zax. "The spirits in this house, they're drawn to you, Dr. Miller. You're different, special somehow. They believe you can help them." Zax felt a chill run down his spine. Could the ghost sense that he wasn't human? He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. "What can you tell us about Elizabeth and Victor Crowley?" Sarah closed her eyes again, her hands moving as if tracing invisible patterns in the air. "I see a woman, young, beautiful, but so sad. She's trapped, not just by death, but by something else. A secret," her brow furrowed. "And a man, angry, violent. He's the one who trapped her." "Victor," Thomas muttered, scribbling notes. Sarah continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. "There's another man, younger, kind eyes. He loved her, truly loved her. But something went wrong. So much anger, so much blood." Suddenly, Sarah's eyes flew open, wide with fear. "We're not alone," she whispered. As if on cue, the temperature in the room plummeted. The lights flickered, and a gust of wind swept through the library, scattering papers everywhere. In the corner of the room, a misty form began to take shape. Zax's heart raced as he recognized the figure materializing before them. Elizabeth Crowley, just as she had appeared in the old photographs. but translucent and glowing with an otherworldly light. Sarah gasped, clutching Thomas's arm. Even the professor, for all his experience with the paranormal, looked shaken. Elizabeth's ghost turned her sad eyes to Zach's. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You've come to help us, to uncover the truth." Gathering his courage, Zach stepped forward. "Yes, we have. Please, Elizabeth, tell us what happened that night." The ghost's form flickered, emotion playing across her ethereal features. "Victor was a cruel man," she began, her voice filled with long-buried pain. "He married me for my youth and beauty, but treated me like a possession. When I fell in love with James, Victor's anger knew no bounds." "James," Thomas muttered. "The J from the letter." Elizabeth nodded, a ghostly tear sliding down her cheek. "James Farrow, Victor's business partner. We planned to run away together, to start a new life. But Victor found out. That night, he confronted us. He was so angry, so violent. James tried to protect me, but Victor, he had a gun." The ghost's form flickered violently, the room growing colder still. Books flew off shelves, and the antique chandelier swayed ominously. "Elizabeth," Zach said softly, trying to calm the spirit, "what happened next?" The ghost seemed to gather herself. "Victor shot James," I screamed, tried to stop him, but he turned the gun on me. As I fell, I saw James lunge at Victor. There was a struggle, another shot. Then, darkness. As Elizabeth's story ended, a new presence filled the room. Angry, violent, pulsing with malevolent energy. A deep, masculine voice boomed through the house. "Lies, all lies." The ghostly form of Victor Crowley materialized, his face contorted with rage. He lunged towards Elizabeth's spirit, but Zach's, acting on instinct, stepped between them. "Stop," Zach shouted, his voice carrying an authority that surprised even him. "This ends now, Victor. The truth is out." Victor's ghost turned its furious gaze on Zach's. "You know nothing. She betrayed me. They both did." Sarah, her voice shaking but determined, spoke up. "No, Victor. You betrayed them. You betrayed love itself with your jealousy and violence." As the two ghosts faced off, the house itself seemed to groan and shake. Picture frames crashed to the floor, and a fissure appeared in one wall, spreading like a spider's web. Thomas grabbed Zach's arm. "We need to end this now. If we don't, the spirit's anger could tear this place apart, with us in it." Zach nodded, his mind racing. He thought of everything he'd learned about human emotions, about love and hate, justice and redemption. In that moment, he understood why the spirits had been drawn to him. As an outsider, he could see their story with fresh eyes, without the biases of human society. "Victor, Elizabeth, James," Zach called out, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Listen to me. This anger, this pain, it's kept you trapped here for nearly a century. But it doesn't have to be this way." The spirits paused, their attention focused on Zach's. "Victor," Zach continued, "your actions that night were born of jealousy and rage. You couldn't bear to let Elizabeth go, to let her be happy without you. But in trying to possess her, you lost everything. Your life, your legacy, your very soul." Victor's ghost flickered, the anger in his eyes mixing with something else, regret. Zach turned to Elizabeth and the newly materialized form of James, their spectral hands intertwined. "And you too. Your love was real, but the secrecy, the affair, it led to this tragedy. You all made mistakes, but the time for blame is long past." The house grew quiet, the violent energy dissipating. Zach pressed on, drawing on everything he'd learned about humanity in his time on Earth. Humans are capable of great love, but also great darkness. What happened here was a tragedy born of the worst of human emotions. But humans are also capable of forgiveness, of growth. Even in death, you have that capacity. Victor's ghost seemed to shrink, the rage draining out of him. I was so angry, so afraid of losing her. I never meant. I know, Zack said gently. And now you have a choice. You can hold on to that anger forever, or you can let it go. Find peace. Elizabeth's ghost stepped forward, her ethereal hand reaching out to Victor. We were all at fault, in our own ways. Can we not forgive, after all this time? For a long moment, the three ghosts looked at each other, a century of pain and regret passing between them. Then, slowly, Victor nodded. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely a whisper. For everything. As the words left Victor's spectral lips, a warm light began to fill the room. The oppressive energy that had permeated the house for so long started to lift. Elizabeth turned to Zax, her form already beginning to fade. Thank you, she said, her voice filled with gratitude. You've set us free. James nodded in agreement. Your perspective, your understanding. It was what we needed, what we've been waiting for all these years. Victor, too, began to fade, his final words tinged with regret and hope. Perhaps, in whatever comes next, we can find the peace we couldn't in life. As the three spirits faded away, the warm light grew brighter, enveloping the room. Zax, Thomas, and Sarah shielded their eyes. When the light finally dimmed, they found themselves alone in the library, the house silent and still. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice filled with awe. I've never experienced anything like that before. The release of energy. It was incredible. Thomas nodded, looking around the room in wonder. You did it, Dr. Miller. You helped them find peace. The haunting. I think it's over. Zack sank into a chair, feeling drained but strangely exhilarated. He had come to Earth to study humanity, but he had never expected to play such a pivotal role in a human drama. In helping the spirits find peace, he felt he had gained a deeper understanding of the human experience than he ever could have through mere observation. As the three of them sat in the now peaceful library, processing what had just occurred, Zax realized that his mission had irrevocably changed. He was no longer just an observer of humanity. He had become a part of their world, their stories, their journey. The mysteries of 1313 Crown Row had been solved, but for Zax, a new chapter was just beginning. As he looked at Thomas and Sarah, he knew that he had found not just allies in his research, but true friends. And in that moment, surrounded by the echoes of a century-old tragedy turned to peace, Zax felt more human than he ever had before. Resolution and understanding. In the days following the dramatic confrontation with the spirits, 1313 Crown Row underwent a transformation. The oppressive atmosphere that had permeated the house for nearly a century lifted, replaced by a sense of peace and quiet contentment. Zax found himself experiencing the house anew, marveling at its beauty and history without the undercurrent of supernatural dread. On a crisp morning about a week after the events in the library, Zax sat on the front porch, sipping a cup of coffee, a human habit he'd grown quite fond of. He watched as his neighbors went about their daily routines, feeling a newfound connection to the community he joined. Professor Hawthorne's car pulled up, and the historian emerged, carrying his ever-present leather satchel. "Good morning, Dr. Miller," he called out cheerfully. "How are you finding the house these days?" Zax smiled, gesturing for Thomas to join him on the porch. "Peaceful," he replied. "It's as if a great weight has been lifted. Please, have a seat." As Thomas settled into a rocking chair, Zax poured him a cup of coffee. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, enjoying the autumn morning. "You know," Thomas began, his voice thoughtful, "I've been studying the paranormal for decades, but I've never experienced anything quite like what happened here. You have a gift, Zachary." Zax felt a flutter of anxiety. Had the professor sensed something about his true nature? "Oh, what do you mean?" Thomas leaned forward, his eyes alight with curiosity. "Your ability to connect with the spirits, to understand and mediate their conflict. It was remarkable." I've never seen anyone bridge the gap between the living and the dead quite like that. Relaxing slightly, Zack shrugged. I simply tried to understand their perspective, to see the humanity in their story. Exactly, Thomas exclaimed. That's what makes you unique. You approach these mysteries with the objectivity of a scientist, but also with a deep empathy for the human condition. It's a rare combination. Zack pondered this, realizing that his alien perspective had indeed given him a unique vantage point from which to understand human nature. His mission to study humanity had evolved in ways he never could have anticipated. Thomas, Zack said slowly, making a decision. There's something I need to tell you. Something about who and what I really am. The professor raised an eyebrow, waiting patiently as Zack gathered his thoughts. Taking a deep breath, Zack reached for the holographic projector that maintained his human disguise. With a flicker, the image of Zachary Miller disappeared, revealing Zack's true form, his purple fur, iridescent scales, and distinctly non-human features. Thomas's eyes widened, his coffee cup slipping from his grasp and shattering on the porch. For a long moment, he stared at Zack in stunned silence. I'm not from Earth, Zack said, his voice barely above a whisper. I came here to study human culture, to understand your species. I never meant to deceive you, but I couldn't reveal my true nature without compromising my mission. To Zack's surprise, Thomas began to laugh, a deep, hearty chuckle that grew into full-blown laughter. Oh, my dear friend, he said, wiping tears from his eyes. I suspected there was something different about you, but this is beyond my wildest imaginings. Zack blinked, confused by the professor's reaction. You're not afraid, angry. Thomas shook his head, still chuckling. Afraid? My boy, I spent my entire career studying the unknown, the unexplained. To meet a being from another world, it's the greatest discovery of my life. As Thomas peppered Zack with questions about his homeworld and the reason for his visit, Zack felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had feared rejection or worse upon revealing his true nature, but instead he found acceptance and curiosity. Over the next few hours, Zack shared the story of his mission, his observations of humanity, and how his experiences in 1313 Crown Row had changed his perspective. Thomas listened with rapt attention, occasionally jotting notes in his ever-present journal. You know, Thomas said thoughtfully as Zack concluded his tale, your unique perspective was exactly what was needed to resolve the haunting. You saw the humanity in those spirits in a way that perhaps no human could have. Zack nodded, understanding dawning. I came here to study humans, but in the process, I've become a part of your world. I've experienced your joys, your sorrows, your conflicts and resolutions. I've learned that humanity is far more complex and beautiful than I ever could have imagined from afar. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the porch, Thomas stood to leave. Zack, he said, using the alien's true name for the first time. What you've discovered here, the connections you've made, they're invaluable, not just for your research, but for the potential of future understanding between our peoples. Zack rose, extending a hand in the human gesture of friendship he'd come to appreciate. Thank you, Thomas, for your help with the house and for your acceptance. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm grateful to have allies, friends like you in this world. As Thomas drove away, Zack turned to look at 1313 Crown Row. The house stood silent and peaceful, its windows gleaming in the fading light. It was no longer just a base for his research or a haunted relic of the past. It had become a home, a place of connection between worlds. In the weeks that followed, Zack continued his research, but with a new focus. He began documenting not just the observable facts of human culture, but the intangible aspects, the emotions, the relationships, the capacity for growth and change that he had witnessed firsthand. Sarah Chen became a frequent visitor, her psychic abilities providing a fascinating counterpoint to Zack's scientific approach. Together with Thomas, they formed an unlikely but effective team, investigating other local mysteries and helping troubled spirits find peace. Zax's reports back to his homeworld took on a new depth and complexity. He spoke not just of human achievements and customs, but of their resilience, their capacity for forgiveness, and their ability to find hope even in the darkest of circumstances. As autumn gave way to winter, Zax stood in the library of 1313 Crown Row, looking out at the snow-covered street. He thought of Elizabeth, Victor, and James, and the century-old tragedy that had finally found resolution. He thought of Thomas and Sarah, and the friendship that had blossomed despite, or perhaps because of, their differences. In that moment, Zax realized that his mission had evolved into something far greater than he had ever imagined. He was no longer just an observer of humanity, but a bridge between worlds. The story of 1313 Crown Row, with its ghosts and secrets, had become a part of his own story, a testament to the power of understanding, empathy, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. As night fell and the streetlights flickered on, Zax settled into his favorite armchair, a book of human poetry in his hands. The house creaked and settled around him, not with the ominous weight of haunting, but with the comfortable sounds of a home well loved. In the quiet of the evening, Zax felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had come to Earth seeking knowledge, but he had found so much more: friendship, purpose, and a deep appreciation for the beautiful complexity of the human experience. Outside, the winter wind whispered through the bare branches of the trees on Crown Row. But inside 1313, all was warm and still. Zax smiled to himself, knowing that whatever challenges the future might hold, he was no longer facing them alone. He had found his place in this strange, wonderful human world, and he was eager to see what new mysteries and discoveries awaited him. As he drifted off to sleep, lulled by the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock, Zax's last thoughts were of gratitude. For the spirits who had led him on this journey, for the friends who had accepted him, and for the endless capacity of the human heart to grow, to forgive, and to embrace the unknown. In the master bedroom, now peaceful and free from the weight of its tragic history, a gentle breeze stirred the curtains. For just a moment, the faint scent of lavender filled the air, a final, gentle goodbye from Elizabeth, a reminder of the power of truth and the enduring nature of love. And so, 1313 Crown Row, once a house of secrets and sorrow, became a beacon of understanding between worlds, a testament to the idea that even across the vast distances of space, compassion and empathy could bridge any gulf, heal any wound, and bring light to even the darkest of histories.